Imagine a universe where every species has learned the same harsh lesson. War is mathematics. War is predictable. War follows rules written in the cold language of logistics and probability. For 10,000 years, conflicts across the galaxy have been calculated affairs, precise, methodical, and utterly sane. Then, humanity stumbles into this cosmic chess game, and suddenly, nothing makes sense anymore. What happens when a species that treats war like an art form meets civilizations that approach it like accounting? What occurs when beings who've never heard the word impossible face enemies who've calculated their defeat down to the decimal point? You're about to witness the moment when mathematical certainty meets human unpredictability, when the galaxy's most sophisticated war machines encounter creatures who weaponize their own extinction, and when the universe learns why some species don't just fight to win, they fight to make their enemies remember them forever. This is the story of how humans didn't just enter a galactic war. They rewrote the very definition of what war could be. Commander Zephyrian Keth Var had seen war in all its calculated glory. Across 17 different star systems, he had witnessed the precise ballet of galactic conflict, where victory was determined by supply lines, technological superiority, and mathematical projections that rarely deviated by more than 3%. War was predictable. War was logical. War was a science that every civilized species had mastered over millennia of refined combat. The holographic display in front of him showed the familiar blue glow of strategic positions, enemy movements tracked with crystalline precision. The hegemony's war computer had already calculated the outcome of the approaching battle with the rebellious Outer Rim colonies with 97.3% certainty. Victory would require exactly 1,247 ships, 892,000 ground troops, and approximately 73 standard galactic days. The numbers never lied. "Sir, we're detecting an anomalous signature entering the contested zone," reported Lieutenant Vextera from her console, her multi-jointed fingers dancing across holographic controls. The Zenthari officer's compound eyes reflected the data streams with mathematical precision. Kethvar's scaled hide rippled with mild irritation. Anomalies were inefficient. Identify the signature. Is it one of the Rim Coalition species attempting a flanking maneuver? Negative, sir. The signature doesn't match any known vessel configuration in our databases. The ship appears to be primitive by our standards. Limited shielding, basic weaponry, and what appears to be chemical-based propulsion systems supplementing their primitive fusion drives. The commander's elongated skull tilted as he processed this information. Primitive species occasionally stumbled into galactic conflicts, usually retreating quickly once they realized the scale of forces they faced. It was an unfortunate but brief interruption to otherwise perfectly planned campaigns. "Display the vessel," he commanded. The main viewer shimmered and focused on what could only be described as an elegant disaster of engineering. The ship appeared to be constructed from multiple different technologies cobbled together with desperate ingenuity. Solar panels jury-rigged alongside fusion exhausts, communications arrays that seemed to be broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, and what appeared to be projectile weapons mounted next to energy cannons clearly not designed for the same power grid. "By the Seven Suns," whispered Tactical Officer Mordim from his station. The massive Krogian's rocky exterior actually shifted color slightly, a sign of genuine surprise in his species. What manner of creature builds such a thing? Kethvar studied the readings more carefully. Ship composition analysis shows steel, titanium, and what appears to be, is that ceramic plating? Confirmed, sir. Ceramic, and what our computers are identifying as some form of reactive armor. The ship appears to be constructed from at least 47 different technological paradigms, none of which should function together. Yet it's holding together, Kethvar mused, his strategic mind beginning to work. Attempt communication. Find out what species this is, and advise them to withdraw from the combat zone immediately. Lieutenant Vextera activated the communications array, broadcasting on standard galactic frequencies. The response came back almost immediately, but not through normal channels. Instead, signals began arriving on radio waves, quantum entanglement communicators, bioneural networks, and what appear to be light-based Morse code all simultaneously. "Sir, they're responding on every frequency. All of them. At once." The main speaker crackled to life with a voice that somehow managed to sound both professional and slightly unhinged. This is Captain Sarah Chun of the UES Determination, representing the United Earth Alliance. We are responding to the distress signal from the Outer Rim colonies and are here to provide humanitarian assistance. Silence filled the command bridge. Humanitarian assistance. In a war zone, Kethvar's tactical computer began running probability analyses on this statement and promptly returned error messages. Captain Chun, Kethvar began, his voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of galactic military protocol. You are entering a declared combat zone. The hegemony strongly advises you to withdraw to a safe distance while military operations conclude. Negative, hegemony command. We have received reports of civilian populations under threat. The UEA does not abandon civilians. Captain, you appear to have a single ship. Our fleet consists of over 2,000 vessels. Your intervention would be mathematically insignificant. There is a pause and then something that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Commander, I think you might be working with some outdated math. Before Kethvar could respond, his sensors officer suddenly straightened at her station, her tentacles moving in rapid, agitated patterns. Sir, I'm detecting massive energy signatures approaching the system. Multiple signatures. Very large signatures. The Rim Coalition fleet? Kethvar asked, though his computer showed no scheduled arrival of enemy reinforcements. Negative, sir. These signatures are, sir. I've never seen anything like this. The main display shifted to show the edge of the star system, where space itself seemed to be tearing apart. But instead of the elegant exit wounds of traditional faster-than-light travel, these tears looked violent, almost angry. Ships began emerging not in the precise formations of civilized warfare, but in chaotic clusters that somehow maintained perfect tactical positioning despite their apparent disorder. Olian sisters, Breed Murdim. How many ships is that? Lieutenant Vextera's voice was barely a whisper. Computer estimates 14,000 vessels, sir. But they're not following any known design paradigms. Each ship appears to be completely unique. Kethvar watched in growing amazement as the human fleet spread across space like a virus of organized chaos. No two ships were identical. Massive battleships that looked like flying cities cruised alongside sleek destroyers that seemed built for ramming. Carrier vessels disgorged clouds of fighter craft that moved in patterns no sane computer would calculate, and support ships that appeared to be converted civilian vessels bristling with improvised weaponry. Captain Chun, Kethvar managed, his voice carrying a note he hadn't heard from himself in centuries. Uncertainty. That's quite a fleet for a species we've never encountered. Oh, Commander, you haven't encountered us because we've been busy. See, about 300 years ago, we had this little disagreement about whether one group of humans was inherently superior to another group of humans. It got a bit heated. Took us most of 2 centuries to sort out. A 2-century war? Kethvar's mind tried to process this. Most galactic conflicts were resolved in months, once proper mathematical analysis determined the victor. Actually, that was just one of them. See, we had this period where every human nation decided they needed to fight every other human nation just to make sure who was strongest. Then, we had some disagreements about economic systems. Then, some more about religion. Then about resources. Then about ideologies we invented just to have something new to fight about. The human captain's voice carried an almost conversational tone that somehow made the words more terrifying. Point is, Commander, we've spent about 500 years fighting the most vicious, determined, innovative, and absolutely ruthless opponents in the universe. Ourselves. Every strategy we've developed has been tested against opponents who knew exactly how we thought, who shared our technology, and who were just as motivated to survive as we were. Kethvar found himself leaning forward despite himself. And now we got all that experience, plus the galaxy's most dangerous trait. We've learned to work together. Every ship in that fleet represents a different human culture, a different approach to problem solving, a different way of looking at impossible situations. And, Captain, we've never met a situation we couldn't make worse for someone. Tactical Officer Mordim's rocky features had shifted to a deep amber hue. Sir, the human fleet is not taking any recognizable formation. They appear to be spreading out randomly across the system. Not randomly, corrected another voice from the human ship. Organically. Each captain is moving to where they feel they can do the most good. or the most damage, depending on your perspective. This is highly irregular, Kethvar protested, his worldview of orderly warfare struggling to process what he was witnessing. How do you coordinate 14,000 vessels without central command protocols? Oh, we have central command, Captain Chen replied cheerfully. Admiral Rodriguez is in charge of overall strategy. But we've learned that the best way to lead humans in combat is to point them at something that needs fixing and get out of their way. But the mathematics of fleet coordination require, Commander, let me save you some time. Human tactics don't follow mathematics. We follow something we call aggressive problem solving. Watch. Across the system, the human fleet suddenly shifted into motion, but not in any pattern Kethvar recognized. Instead of the elegant geometric formations favored by civilized warfare, the human ships moved like a living thing, flowing around obstacles, clustering where needed, spreading thin where space allowed. It was chaos, but chaos with purpose. Sir, Lieutenant Vextera called out, her voice tight with disbelief. The Rim Coalition fleet is responding to the human arrival. They're requesting parley. Kethvar blinked in surprise. The coalition wants to negotiate. They've never accepted anything but complete independence. Sir, they're specifically requesting to negotiate with the humans. Captain Chen's voice crackled over the communication system again. Admiral Rodriguez would be happy to mediate discussions. Fair warning, though, Commander. Humans have some strong opinions about freedom and self-determination. We're not exactly neutral parties here. This is highly irregular, Kethvar repeated, but even as he said it, he realized the inadequacy of the words. Everything about this situation was beyond irregular. It was unprecedented. Tell me, Commander, Captain Chen continued, what exactly are you fighting about anyway? Our long-range scans show the outer rim colonies are primarily agricultural and mining worlds, not exactly strategic military targets. Kethvar found himself explaining, almost against his will. The colonies declared independence from the hegemony 15 years ago. They have rejected all offers of negotiated settlement and have continued to expand their territorial claims. And what do they want in the first place? Local governance rights, reduced taxation, and cultural autonomy. There was another of those pauses that somehow felt ominous. So they wanted democracy, fair taxes, and the right to their own culture. Essentially, yes. And you said no. The hegemony cannot allow the precedent of successful rebellion. Order must be maintained. Commander, Captain Chen's voice had lost its conversational tone and gained something that made Kethvar's survival instincts suddenly activate. I think we need to have a longer conversation about this. In person. Captain, I appreciate your offer of mediation, but this is an internal hegemony matter. Commander, you've got 14,000 ships full of humans who just learned that you're trying to bomb people for wanting democracy. That's not an internal matter anymore. That's what we call a really bad idea that we take personally. Kethvar looked at his tactical display, where 14,000 human vessels continued their organic dance through space, and realized that his perfect mathematical certainty had just encountered something entirely outside the equations. For the first time in his military career, he had no idea what was going to happen next. And somehow, he suspected that was exactly what the humans were counting on. The meeting chamber aboard the Neutral Station Arbitration Point 7 had hosted thousands of diplomatic conferences over its 3-century existence. The sterile white walls had witnessed treaty negotiations, trade agreements, and countless hours of careful mathematical diplomacy. Never had they witnessed anything like the controlled chaos that followed the human delegation's arrival. Commander Kethvar arrived precisely on time, as was proper, accompanied by his staff of 12 specialists, each an expert in their respective fields of military law, territorial governance, and strategic planning. They took their assigned seats in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate, their data pads loaded with precisely organized legal precedents and mathematical proofs of hegemony authority. The human delegation arrived 7 minutes late in what could generously be described as a controlled explosion of activity. Captain Sarah Chan entered first, but not alone. Behind her came a parade of humans that defied every protocol Kethvar knew. A massive man whose uniform appeared to be cut from different cloth entirely introduced himself as Admiral Rodriguez, followed by someone called a cultural attaché, who immediately began scanning the room with devices Kethvar didn't recognize. Then came individuals identified as everything from civilian representative to agricultural specialist to local history expert, and, most confusing of all, someone simply called the professor. "Sorry we're late," Captain Shin said, settling into a chair that was clearly not designed for human anatomy with apparent comfort. "We had to stop by the Outer Rim colonies first. Actually talk to the people involved." "You spoke to the rebels?" Kethvar asked, his tactical mind immediately calculating the security implications. "We spoke to the colonists," corrected the cultural attaché, a woman whose eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the chamber with uncomfortable intensity. "Amazing people. Did you know they've developed 17 different agricultural techniques that could revolutionize food production across the galaxy? And their approach to multi-species cooperation is fascinating." Ketvar blingshit. Multi-species cooperation? The professor, an elderly human whose hair seemed to defy gravitational norms, leaned forward with evident enthusiasm. "Oh yes, absolutely remarkable. They've got Zinthri farming specialists working alongside Krogjon mineral extraction experts, and they've developed translation protocols that account for cultural context rather than just linguistic conversion. The efficiency improvements alone, professors," Admiral Rodriguez interrupted gently. "Perhaps we could focus on the immediate situation?" "Right, sorry. We get excited about problem solving," the professor said, not looking apologetic at all. Kethvar struggled to regain control of the conversation. "The immediate situation is a rebellion against lawful hegemony authority. The mathematics are quite clear." "Are they?" asked the civilian representative, a man whose uniform looked like it had been tailored by 17 different people with 17 different ideas about what military dress should be. "Because we ran some numbers of our own." Before Kethvar could respond, holographic displays suddenly filled the air above the conference table, showing data streams that made his carefully prepared presentations look primitive by comparison. "See, here's the thing about mathematics," continued the civilian representative, whose casual manner somehow made his words more unsettling. "Numbers are only as good as the assumptions you start with. And your assumptions are, well, they're interesting." The holographic display shifted to show resource flow charts, population dynamics, and economic projections that went far beyond anything Kethvar had seen before. "You've calculated the cost of military subjugation at approximately 2.7 million credits per planet, assuming standard resistance patterns, and a 15-month suppression campaign," the human continued. "But you haven't calculated the cost of ongoing occupation, the economic impact of destroyed infrastructure, or the resources required to prevent future rebellions." Admiral Rodriguez gestured, and the display expanded to show cost projections that made Kethvar's tactical computer begin showing error messages. "More importantly," the admiral added, "you haven't calculated the cost of making an enemy of every other species that might someday want the same things these colonists want." Kethvar felt his worldview beginning to strain. The hegemony has maintained order for 10,000 years using precisely these methods. "Commander," Captain Shin said, her voice carrying that same dangerous gentleness, "can I ask you something? In those 10,000 years, how many rebellions have you had to suppress?" 17 major rebellions, 43 minor insurrections, and approximately 200 isolated incidents of civil disobedience. The humans exchanged glances that somehow conveyed volumes of information without a word being spoken. "How many of those were about the same issues?" asked the cultural attaché. Kethvar consulted his datapad. "Approximately, most of them involved requests for increased local autonomy." "And after you suppressed each rebellion, did the underlying issues get resolved?" "Order was restored," Kethvar replied, but even as he said it, he realized how inadequate the answer sounded. The professor leaned forward again, his enthusiasm undimmed. "Commander, may I suggest that you've been treating symptoms rather than diseases? You've created a perfect mathematical system for winning battles, but you've never actually solved the problem that causes the battles. The problem is rebellion against lawful authority." "No," said the civilian representative firmly. "The problem is that sentient beings want to have a say in how they're governed, and your system doesn't provide that in any meaningful way." Kethvar found himself struggling with concepts his military education had never prepared him for. "But democracy is chaotic, inefficient. How can billions of individuals make better decisions than trained specialists?" "They can't," Admiral Rodriguez admitted cheerfully. "Democracy is absolutely terrible at making optimal decisions quickly. It's slow, messy, and sometimes produces results that make every expert in the room want to scream. Then why? Because it's not about optimal decisions, Commander. It's about legitimate decisions. When people have a real voice in making the rules they live by, they're far more likely to follow those rules, even when they disagree with specific decisions. The holographic display shifted to show what appeared to be hundreds of different governmental systems, all connected by flowing lines of data. Humans tried your approach for a while, Captain Chin explained. Centralized authority, rule by experts, mathematical optimization of resource allocation. Very efficient. Also led to some of the worst disasters in our history. What changed? Kethvar asked, genuinely curious now. We learned that the most dangerous sentence in any language is "we know what's best for you," the cultural attaché replied. Because maybe you do know what's best. Maybe your mathematics are perfect, and your experts are brilliant, and your system is optimal in every measurable way. But if the people living under that system don't agree to it, then you haven't created order. You created a pressure cooker. The professor gestured excitedly, and the display showed what appeared to be historical timelines stretching back thousands of years. Every system based on imposed order eventually faces the same problem. You can suppress dissent, but you can't eliminate it. It just goes underground and gets more concentrated until it explodes. But surely, Kethvar protested, some authority must exist. Some structure must be maintained. Absolutely, Admiral Rodriguez agreed. The question is where that authority comes from. Does it flow down from above because someone decided they should be in charge? Or does it flow up from below because people agreed to be governed? Kethvar stared at the data flowing across the holographic displays, showing systems of government he had never imagined, mathematical models that accounted for variables his training had never considered, and cost-benefit analyses that made his perfect calculations look like children's arithmetic. This is all very philosophical, he said finally, but we still have an immediate situation. The colonies are in rebellion. Order must be restored. Commander, Captain Shin said, and her voice carried something that made every human in the room suddenly pay closer attention. Let me ask you a direct question. Are you here to find a solution to this problem, or are you here to justify a decision that's already been made? Kethvar found himself genuinely considering the question, which surprised him. Military protocols called for him to reassert hegemony authority and in this discussion. But the humans had presented data that challenged assumptions he had never thought to question. I am here, he said slowly, to restore order in the most efficient manner possible. Excellent, the Admiral said, leaning back in his chair with evident satisfaction. Then, let's talk about what efficient really means. The holographic display shifted again, this time showing the current deployment of the hegemony fleet. You've got 2,000 ships positioned for a military solution that your own computers predict will cost 2.7 million credits and take 15 months to complete, the civilian representative began. But that's assuming everything goes according to plan. Our mathematics are extremely reliable, Kethvar replied. I'm sure they are, for normal opponents. But, Commander, how do your computers factor in variables they've never encountered before? Before Kethvar could ask what that meant, the display expanded to show the human fleet still moving in their organic patterns throughout the system. Here's what we learned fighting ourselves for centuries, Captain Chun said. Mathematical models work great until someone changes the rules of the game. What are you suggesting? Admiral Rodriguez gestured, and the display showed simulation after simulation, each one showing different scenarios for the coming conflict. We're suggesting that your mathematical certainty is based on your opponents following patterns you understand. Fighting for resources, fighting for territory, fighting for strategic advantage. All very rational, very predictable. Yes, precisely. But, Commander, the professor said, his enthusiasm becoming almost infectious. What happens when your opponents aren't fighting for resources or territory or strategic advantage? What happens when they're fighting for something your computers can't quantify? Such as the right to exist as free beings, the cultural attaché said simply. Commander, the colonists aren't fighting because they've calculated they can win. They're fighting because they believe some things are worth fighting for even if you lose. Kethvar felt something cold settling in his stomach. That's irrational. Completely, Captain Chin agreed. And that's why your mathematics keep producing rebellions instead of solutions. You're trying to solve an emotional problem with a logical system. The holographic displays suddenly shifted to show something that made Kethvar's tactical instincts scream warnings. The human fleet had moved into what appeared to be random positions throughout the system, but as the display highlighted connection patterns between ships, he realized he was looking at something unprecedented. Every human ship in that fleet represents a different approach to problem-solving, Admiral Rodriguez explained. Different cultures, different technologies, different ways of thinking about impossible situations. And they're all connected by communication networks that allow them to share information and adapt to changing situations faster than any central command could ever coordinate. It's like a brain, the professor added enthusiastically. But a brain where every neuron is a capital ship with its own ideas about how to solve problems. Kethvar stared at the display, trying to understand what he was seeing. This is completely against every principle of fleet coordination. Yes, Captain Shin said cheerfully. And it's absolutely terrifying to fight against because we don't coordinate like a normal fleet. We think like a collective intelligence that really doesn't like bullies. The Cold War settled deeper into Kethvar's stomach as he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. Not just a fleet of ships, but a completely different approach to conflict that his training had never prepared him for. "What are you proposing?" he asked quietly. "That's simple," Admiral Rodriguez replied. "We're proposing that instead of spending years and millions of credits fighting a war that will just create more wars, you sit down with the colonists and figure out how to give them what they want without giving up what you need. And if that's impossible..." The humans exchanged those meaningful glances again, and Kethvar realized that he really didn't want to hear the answer to his question. "Commander," Captain Chun said finally, "in 500 years of fighting impossible wars, we've learned something important. Impossible just means nobody's been creative enough yet." 3 days after the conference at Arbitration Point 7, Commander Kethvar found himself doing something no hegemony officer had done in recorded history. He was visiting a colony world not to conquer it, but to understand it. The shuttlecraft descended through the atmosphere of Kepler's Dream, the largest of the rebellious colonies, with an escort that defied every military protocol he knew. Instead of a proper honor guard, he was accompanied by Captain Chun, 2 human specialists whose titles he still didn't fully understand, and a collection of colonial representatives who seemed genuinely excited to show him their world. "Now remember," Captain Chun said as the shuttle touched down, "these people aren't rebels plotting against galactic civilization. They're farmers, engineers, teachers, and artists who just wanted to live their lives without someone else making all their decisions for them." Through the shuttle's viewport, Kethvar could see the colonial settlement spreading before them, and nothing about it matched his expectations of a rebellious stronghold. Instead of military fortifications and propaganda broadcasts, he saw agricultural terraces that seemed to flow organically across the landscape, buildings that appeared to grow from the terrain rather than dominate it, and what looked suspiciously like children playing in carefully maintained parks. "This doesn't look like a military installation," he observed. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the human specialist who had introduced herself as an organizational systems expert, laughed. "Commander, that's because it's not. It's a place where people live." The shuttle bay doors opened to reveal a welcoming committee that included representatives from 6 different species, all wearing clothing that seemed both practical and somehow artistic at the same time. No uniforms, no military ranks visible, no obvious hierarchy that Kethvar could identify. "Commander Kethvar," said a Zenthari female whose compound eyes sparkled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Welcome to Kepler's Dream. I'm Counselor Nextara, and we're honored to have you visit our home." "Counselor," Kethvar asked, "what is your military rank?" "I don't have one," she replied, seeming genuinely puzzled by the question. "I'm a hydroponic engineer. The community elected me to the council because I'm good at figuring out how to make things grow in difficult conditions." Dr. Reeves stepped forward with evident enthusiasm. "Commander, this is what we wanted you to see. The colony doesn't operate on military hierarchy because it's not a military organization. It's a community." As they walked through the settlement, Kethvar found his understanding of rebellion being systematically dismantled. Instead of propaganda posters calling for resistance against the hegemony, he saw community bulletin boards listing harvest schedules, childcare cooperatives, and classes on everything from quantum mechanics to traditional Krog-John stone sculpture. Instead of weapon stockpiles, he saw workshops where multiple species worked together on projects he couldn't identify, but which seemed to involve improving everything from communication systems to agricultural efficiency. What is that? He asked, pointing to a large building where the sound of animated discussion could be heard from multiple species. That's our innovation center, explained a young Krog John whose rocky exterior had been carved with intricate patterns that somehow managed to look both traditional and futuristic. We bring together different approaches to problem solving and see what happens when we combine them. Innovation Center? Ketvar repeated. Captain Shin grinned. Commander, remember how humans developed different solutions to similar problems because we were isolated from each other for thousands of years? Well, these colonies have been doing the same thing, but deliberately. They take the best ideas from every species and figure out how to make them work together. They entered the building to find what could only be described as organized creative chaos. Zen3 engineers were working alongside Krogjan geologists and human technicians on projects that seemed to involve everything from atmospheric processing to faster-than-light communication improvements. The air hummed with excited discussion in multiple languages, supplemented by translation devices that seemed far more sophisticated than anything in hegemony standard equipment. The translation systems alone, Dr. Reeves whispered, are about 50 years ahead of anything the hegemony has developed. They don't just translate words, they translate concepts and cultural context. A human woman approached them, her clothes covered in what appeared to be mineral dust from several different worlds. Commander Ketvar, I'm Dr. Lisa Park, xenogeology specialist. Would you like to see what we've been working on? Xenogeology? Ketvar asked. She studies how different species approach geological problems, Counselor Nextara explained. Krogjan mineral sense, Zen3 chemical analysis, human drilling techniques, plus methods from 12 other species. The efficiency improvements from mining operations are remarkable. Dr. Park led them to a holographic display that showed mining operations of a scale and efficiency that made Ketvar's tactical computer start calculating economic implications. We've increased extraction efficiency by 340% while reducing environmental impact by 67%, Dr. Park explained enthusiastically. And the best part is, every technique we develop gets shared with all the colonies automatically. Share? Ketvar asked. Don't you maintain competitive advantages? The humans and colonists exchanged those meaningful looks again. Commander, Captain Shun said gently, when you're building a civilization instead of fighting a war, competition works differently. They're not trying to beat each other. They're trying to solve problems together. They continued the tour, and with each stop, Ketvar felt his understanding of the situation becoming more complex. The medical center, where Zen3 biochemistry was combined with human surgical techniques and Krogjan mineral therapy to create treatments that no single species could have developed. The communication hub, where children from 6 different species learned together using teaching methods that somehow accommodated radically different learning styles simultaneously. The agricultural research stations where food production techniques were being developed that could revolutionize nutrition across the galaxy. This is all very impressive, Ketvar said finally, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue of lawful authority. The hegemony requires, Commander, interrupted a voice from behind them. They turned to see an elderly human man approaching, his hair white with age, but his eyes sharp with intelligence. I'm Professor Michael Chong, and I think there's something you need to understand about authority. Professor Chong was the chief architect of the colonial governmental system, Counselor Nextara explained. He's been studying political organization for longer than most species have had spaceflight. Professor Chong gestured toward a nearby bench, and they sat overlooking the main settlement where multiple species moved about their daily business with a harmony that seemed both natural and carefully maintained. Commander, the hegemony's authority is based on power, correct? The ability to enforce compliance through superior military force. Essentially, yes. And how has that worked out over the past 10,000 years? Ketvar found himself thinking about the endless cycle of rebellions, suppressions, and new rebellions that had marked hegemony history. There have been challenges. Commander, let me show you a different kind of authority. Professor Chong gestured toward the settlement. Every person you see here, from every species, chose to be part of this community. Not because they were forced to, not because they were born into it, but because they looked at what we were building and decided it was something worth being part of. But choice leads to chaos, Ketvar protested. Without central control, how do you maintain order? We don't maintain order, Counselor Nextara said. We create it together every day. Dr. Reeves activated a holographic display that showed the settlement's organizational structure, and Kethvar found himself looking at something that violated every principle of command hierarchy he had ever learned. There's no single leader, he observed. Correct. Instead, we have what humans call distributed authority. Different people lead different aspects of community life based on their expertise and the community's trust in their judgment. But how do you make decisions? How do you resolve conflicts? The same way humans learn to resolve conflicts after centuries of war, Captain Chin replied. We talk until we find solutions that everyone can live with. That must take forever. Sometimes, Professor Chang admitted. But, Commander, we've learned something important. Time spent building consensus is time saved avoiding rebellion. When people help make the decisions that affect their lives, they're invested in making those decisions work. Kethvar studied the organizational display more carefully. This is incredibly complex. It has to be, Dr. Rees explained. Simple systems work fine for simple problems. But when you're trying to organize multiple species with different biology, different cultures, different ways of thinking about everything from time to family relationships to the nature of existence itself, you need systems that can handle that complexity. And it works. Look around you, Counselor next to us said. We've been operating this way for 15 years. No internal wars, no oppression of minority species, crime rates lower than any hegemony world, and innovation rates that exceed anything in recorded galactic history. They spent the rest of the day touring different aspects of the settlement, each stop revealing layers of complexity that Kethvar had never imagined. The conflict resolution centers where disputes were handled through mediation processes that somehow accounted for the cultural differences between species. The resource allocation systems that ensured equitable distribution without stifling individual initiative. The education centers where children learned not just technical skills, but how to work together across species barriers. As the day ended, they gathered in what the colonists called the community circle, an amphitheater built into a natural depression where representatives from across the settlement met regularly to discuss everything from resource planning to cultural celebrations. Commander, Professor Chang said as they watched the sun set over the alien landscape, you came here to understand rebellion. But what you've seen today isn't rebellion at all. What would you call it? Evolution, Captain Chin replied. Commander, the galaxy has been stuck in the same political patterns for 10,000 years. Hierarchical control, rule by force, authority based on power. And it's produced 10,000 years of the same problems. These colonies represent something new, Dr. Rees added. Not rebellion against civilization, but a step forward in what civilization could become. Kethvar sat in silence, watching species that had been strangers to each other 20 years ago working together with a harmony that seemed both natural and carefully cultivated. The hegemony will never accept this, he said finally. Commander, Counselor Nexaros said gently, the hegemony doesn't have to accept it. They just have to recognize that trying to destroy it will cost more than allowing it to exist. And if they choose destruction anyway, the humans exchanged those looks again, and Kethvar realized he still didn't want to hear the answer. Then Captain Chin said quietly, they'll learn why humans spent 500 years becoming very, very good at protecting things we believe in. As they walked back to the shuttle, Kethvar found himself carrying more than just new information. For the first time in his military career, he was carrying doubt about whether mathematical certainty was sufficient for the problems the galaxy actually faced. And he was beginning to understand why that doubt terrified him so much. The emergency session of the Hegemony High Command convened in the orbital fortress above the capital world, its crystalline chambers reflecting the cold light of strategic planning displays that had guided galactic policy for millennia. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen, a massive Draknari whose scaled hide had been scarred by combat across 17 star systems, stood before the assembled commanders with data that challenged everything they thought they knew about human intentions. The reconnaissance reports are disturbing, he growled, his voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's walls resonate. Commander Kethvar's observations suggest the humans are not merely supporting colonial rebellion. They appear to be implementing a systematic alternative to hegemony governance. Around the circular command table, representatives from 12 species studied holographic displays showing colonial worlds transformed into something that defied military categorization. Agricultural productivity that exceeded hegemony worlds by factors that approached impossibility. technological innovation at rates that made their research divisions seem stagnant, social stability indicators that their computers kept flagging as statistical anomalies. Supreme Admiral, interjected Fleet Admiral Zextrai, her zinthery compound eyes reflecting patterns of data analysis. The mathematical models are clear. These colonial systems are unsustainable. No governmental system, based on consensus, can maintain efficiency at scale. And, yet, Commander Kethvar said quietly from his position at the junior officers section, they have been maintaining it. For 15 years. The chamber fell silent. Junior commanders did not typically interrupt fleet admirals, particularly not to contradict fundamental assumptions about political science. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen's head tilted toward Kethvar with predatory attention. Commander, you were tasked with reconnaissance, not political analysis. Yes, sir. However, the political system is integral to their military capabilities. Supreme Admiral, the humans don't think like us. They don't organize like us. And they don't fight like us. Elaborate. Kethvar activated his personal display, showing data he had been gathering since his return from Kepler's dream. Sir, our military doctrine is based on centralized command, standardized equipment, and predictable tactical responses. The human approach appears to be based on distributed decision-making, improvised solutions, and tactical unpredictability. Fleet Admiral Morketh, a Krajan whose rocky exterior had turned dark amber with skepticism, leaned forward. Commander, military effectiveness requires discipline and coordination. Chaos cannot defeat order. Sir, with respect, what I observed was not chaos. It was organized complexity. Kethvar's display shifted to show patterns of human fleet movement that had been tracked over the past week. Instead of standard patrol routes or defensive formations, the human ships moved in constantly shifting patterns that somehow maintained perfect system coverage while appearing completely random. Each ship operates independently, but they're connected by communication networks that allow instantaneous information sharing and tactical coordination. When a situation develops, the nearest appropriate resources respond automatically, without waiting for orders from Central Command. Impossible, declared Fleet Admiral Zextrai. Communication delays alone would make such coordination ineffective at interstellar distances. That's what I thought as well, Kethvar replied. But, sir, the humans have developed communication technologies that appear to operate through quantum entanglement networks linked to biological neural interfaces. Their response times to developing situations are faster than our computers can calculate optimal responses. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen studied the tactical displays with growing unease. You're suggesting they've created a form of collective intelligence. I'm suggesting they created something we don't have tactical doctrine for, Kethvar replied carefully. Sir, every military strategy we know is designed to fight opponents who think the way we think. But the humans don't just think differently, they think together. The chamber's main display suddenly activated, showing an incoming priority communication from Hegemony Intelligence. The image that appeared was of Director Salthmarin, a Vashti whose telepathic abilities made her the ideal head of galactic intelligence operations. Supreme Admiral, Director Salthmarin's voice carried undertones that suggested psychological strain. We have a problem. A significant problem. Report. Our deep intelligence analysis of human governmental structures has revealed something unprecedented. Supreme Admiral, the humans haven't just developed an alternative to hegemony authority. They've developed a form of political organization that's infectious. The assembled commanders exchanged glances of confusion and growing alarm. Explain, demanded Vorthagen. Within the past 6 months, 17 different species within hegemony territory have begun implementing governmental modifications based on colonial models. Not rebellion, sir. Evolution. They're adopting human organizational principles while maintaining nominal hegemony membership. Fleet Admiral Morketh's rocky exterior had shifted to deep red. That's impossible. Our authority is absolute. Sir, that's what makes this so dangerous. They're not challenging our authority directly. They're making it irrelevant. The main display shifted to show political analysis charts that made every commander in the chamber lean forward with alarm. Traditional rebellions challenge authority and must be suppressed, Director Salthmarin continued. But these modifications work within existing legal frameworks while fundamentally changing how authority operates. They're not breaking hegemony law. They're evolving beyond it. What are you recommending? Supreme Admiral Vorthagen asked, though his tone suggested he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Sir, we have three options. First, we can attempt to suppress these modifications through military force. Our analysts predict this would require intervention on approximately 40 worlds simultaneously, with high probability of triggering general rebellion across the affected sectors. And the second option? We can attempt to co-opt these modifications by incorporating them into official hegemony policy. This would require fundamental restructuring of governmental authority and would likely trigger resistance from traditional power structures within the hegemony itself. And the third, we can do nothing and watch the hegemony evolve into something entirely different over the next several decades. The chamber fell into silence that stretched beyond comfortable. Each option represented a fundamental challenge to everything the hegemony had been built upon. Commander Kethvar found himself speaking before his tactical mind could override his growing conviction. Supreme Admiral, there is a fourth option. Every eye in the chamber turned toward him, and Kethvar realized he was about to commit career suicide. But the data he had gathered, the things he had seen, the conversations he had had with beings who thought about governance in ways his education had never prepared him for, all led to a conclusion that his mathematical mind could no longer avoid. We could learn. The silence that followed this statement had a quality that made Kethvar's survival instincts activate. Explain, Supreme Admiral Vorthagen said quietly. Sir, the humans have developed solutions to problems we've been struggling with for 10,000 years. Rebellion, resource allocation efficiency, innovation stagnation, interspecies cooperation. What if instead of treating them as a threat to be eliminated, we treated them as consultants? Fleet Admiral Zextorai's compound eyes had shifted to patterns that indicated profound skepticism. Commander, you're suggesting we legitimize rebellion by treating rebels as advisors. No, sir. I'm suggesting we legitimize success by learning from those who have achieved it. Kethvar activated his display again, showing comparative data that had been keeping him awake for days. Sirs, the colonial worlds have achieved social stability indicators, economic productivity rates, and innovation metrics that exceed the best hegemony worlds by significant margins. If we encountered this data from an unknown civilization, we would be studying their methods to incorporate into our own systems. But we didn't encounter it from an unknown civilization, Fleet Admiral Morketh pointed out. We encountered it from rebels who rejected our authority. Sir, with respect, they didn't reject our authority because they wanted chaos. They rejected it because they found something better. The heretical nature of this statement created a tension in the chamber that seemed to press against the walls. Commander Kethvar, Supreme Admiral Vorthagen said slowly, are you suggesting that the hegemony has been incorrect in its approach to governance? Kethvar realized he had reached the point of no return. His career, his future, everything he had built his life around balanced on his next words. But the mathematical certainty he had been trained to rely upon led to only one conclusion. Sir, I'm suggesting that the universe has gotten more complex than our systems were designed to handle, and the humans have developed adaptive solutions we haven't considered. And the humans themselves? Sir, the humans aren't trying to conquer the galaxy. They're trying to improve it. There's a difference. Director Solf Marin's image leaned forward with interest. Commander, you've had more direct contact with human leadership than any hegemony officer. What is their ultimate objective? Kethvar thought back to his conversations with Captain Chun, Admiral Rodriguez, and the various specialists whose enthusiasm for problem-solving had been both infectious and slightly terrifying. Sir, I believe their ultimate objective is to solve problems they consider unacceptable. Oppression, suffering, wasted potential, systemic inefficiency. They appear to view the current state of galactic civilization as a collection of engineering problems requiring creative solutions. And if we refuse to allow them to implement these solutions? Kethvar remembered the organic patterns of a human fleet, the distributed intelligence of their command structure, and the casual competence with which they had approached impossible situations. Sir, then, they'll implement them anyway, and we'll find ourselves trying to fight a war against an opponent that doesn't follow any rules we understand. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen stood silent for several minutes, studying displays that showed the scope of what they were facing. Not just a military challenge, but a fundamental evolution in how sentient beings organize themselves. Director Solfmarin, he said finally. Prepare detailed analyses of all options. Include long-term projections for each scenario. Yes, sir. Fleet Admiral Morketh, I want full tactical assessments of human capabilities, assuming they maintain their current technological development rates. Understood, sir. Fleet Admiral Zexterai, begin preliminary assessments of how colonial governmental modifications might be adapted for hegemony worlds. Sir, it would require us to consider possibilities we've never considered before, Vorthagen finished. Commander Ketvar. Yes, sir. You will return to the human fleet as our official liaison. Your mission is to understand their intentions and capabilities in detail. Sir, what authority am I authorized to negotiate under? Supreme Admiral Vorthagen turned to face him directly, and Kethvar realized he was looking at a being whose worldview was undergoing fundamental restructuring in real time. Commander, you are authorized to find out what it would take to avoid a war that might destroy everything we've built. As the session concluded and the commanders dispersed to their various tasks, Kethvar found himself contemplating the possibility that his mathematical certainty had led him to the most uncertain conclusion of his career, that sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem was to stop trying to solve it by yourself. 6 months after Commander Kethvar had first encountered the human fleet, he found himself standing on the bridge of the UES Determination, watching something that would have been impossible under any conventional understanding of warfare, the peaceful integration of hegemony and colonial forces in joint operations. Captain Sarah Chun stood beside him, both of them observing through the main viewer as hegemony construction ships worked alongside human vessels and colonial craft to build what the humans insisted on calling a cooperative space station, rather than any of the military designations Kethvar's training suggested. It still violates every principle of military engineering I know, Kethvar admitted, watching a Krajan heavy construction unit guided by human coordination protocols while Zinthri engineers provided real-time structural analysis through quantum-linked communication networks. Commander, Captain Chun replied with a patience she had developed over months of similar conversations. That's because you keep thinking of this as military engineering when it's actually social engineering. The station taking shape before them defied categorization in any tactical manual Kethvar knew. Instead of the geometric precision of hegemony military architecture or the purely functional design of most space installations, the structure seemed to grow organically, adapting its configuration in real time based on the needs of the species working together to build it. Explain the difference, Kethvar said, genuinely curious. Months of working with humans had taught him that his initial assumptions about anything were probably incomplete. Military engineering is about building things that work efficiently for a specific purpose. Dr. Amanda Reeves explained from her position at the Collaborative Design Station. Social engineering is about building things that help different groups work together more effectively. On the display, the station's communication hub was taking shape according to specifications that accommodated the different sensory modalities of 12 species. Visual displays for humans and similar species, harmonic resonance patterns for beings who communicated through sound manipulation, chemical signal processors for species who relied on scent-based information exchange, and electromagnetic field generators for the few species who perceived through energy pattern recognition. The complexity alone, Kethvar mused. Our computers estimate coordination requirements that exceed optimal efficiency by approximately 340%. Which brings us to the fundamental difference between hegemony thinking and human thinking, Professor Chong said, looking up from his analysis of interspecies communication protocols. You're measuring efficiency. We're measuring effectiveness. What's the difference? Admiral Rodriguez, who had been quietly reviewing construction reports, looked up with the expression Kethvar had learned meant he was about to have one of his core assumptions challenged again. Efficiency is about doing things right, the Admiral explained. Effectiveness is about doing the right things. Your optimal efficiency assumes you're trying to solve the right problem. And we weren't. Commander, you were trying to solve the problem of maintaining control. We're trying to solve the problem of helping civilizations grow. Kethvar studied the tactical displays, showing the broader scope of what the humans call the Cooperative Development Project. Across 17 star systems, similar collaborative efforts were underway. Agricultural research stations where multiple species worked together to develop food production techniques that could support the nutritional needs of radically different biologies. Medical facilities where the healing traditions of dozens of cultures were being combined with cutting-edge technology to create treatment approaches that no single species could have imagined. Educational centers where children from across the galaxy learned together using teaching methods that somehow accommodated learning styles that had evolved on completely different worlds. The scale of this undertaking, he said slowly, the resource requirements alone should make it impossible. Should, Captain Chin agreed. But, Commander, we learned something during our centuries of human warfare that apparently the rest of the galaxy never figured out. Which is, when you get people working together on something they believe in, they'll accomplish things that no mathematical model says should be possible. A communication alert drew their attention to the main display, where a message was incoming from Hegemony High Command. Kethvar straightened automatically, his military conditioning asserting itself despite months of working in the chaotic but effective environment of human coordination. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen's image appeared on the screen, but instead of the military formality Kethvar expected, the massive Draknari looked tired, and perhaps something that might have been cautiously optimistic. Commander Kethvar, Captain Tien, Admiral Rodriguez. I'm transmitting the final report from the Hegemony Council's evaluation of the Cooperative Development Project. Kethvar felt his stomach tighten. For 6 months, Hegemony analysts had been studying the results of human collaborative methods, measuring them against traditional governance approaches, and calculating the long-term implications of fundamental changes to how galactic civilization operated. The numbers are remarkable, Supreme Admiral Vorthagen continued. Economic productivity up an average of 290% across participating systems. Social stability indicators improved beyond our measurement parameters. Innovation rates that exceed anything in recorded galactic history. And, most significantly, zero conflicts requiring military intervention. Captain Chin smiled, but Kethvar noticed it was the careful smile she used when she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. However, the Supreme Admiral continued, and there it was, the implementation of these methods requires fundamental restructuring of hegemony authority structures. The Council has been reluctant to approve such extensive changes. What does that mean, practically? Admiral Rodriguez asked. It means the hegemony is prepared to offer a compromise. The colonial worlds will be granted autonomous status within the hegemony framework. Human collaborative methods will be permitted in designated development zones. But core hegemony worlds will maintain traditional governance structures. Kethvar watched the humans exchange those meaningful glances that had become familiar over months of observation, and realized he could now interpret them. This wasn't the solution they had hoped for, but they were already calculating how to work with what was being offered. Supreme Admiral, Captain Chin said carefully, we appreciate the hegemony's willingness to find middle ground, but we have a concern about long-term stability. Explain. Sir, what happens when the autonomous zones consistently outperform the traditional zones in every measurable category? What happens when beings living under traditional authority see others living under collaborative authority and want the same opportunities? The pause that followed this question stretched uncomfortably long. That, Supreme Admiral Vorthagen said finally, is a problem for future administrations to address. Dr. Reeves leaned forward with the expression that indicated she was about to deliver an analysis that would make everyone in the conversation rethink their assumptions. Supreme Admiral, with respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that created the rebellion cycle in the first place. You can't solve systemic problems by creating temporary accommodations. Dr. Reeves, the hegemony has maintained order for 10,000 years by suppressing the symptoms of problems rather than addressing the causes, Professor Chong interrupted gently. Supreme Admiral, you're proposing to create a situation where different populations within the same governmental structure have radically different qualities of life. History suggests that's not a stable long-term solution. Kethvar found himself speaking before his diplomatic instincts could stop him. Supreme Admiral, the humans are correct. Mathematical modeling of the proposed compromise shows increasing probability of systematic instability over time. Commander, you're supposed to be representing hegemony interests. Sir, I believe I am. The hegemony's long-term interests are best served by sustainable solutions rather than temporary accommodations. Captain Chin looked at him with something that might have been pride, and Kethvar realized that somewhere in the past 6 months, his definition of the hegemony's best interest had evolved beyond recognition. What are you proposing? Supreme Admiral Vorthagen asked quietly. Admiral Rodriguez activated a holographic display that showed implementation timelines stretching across decades. We're proposing gradual transition, he said. Start with voluntary pilot programs on worlds that want to try collaborative methods. Provide training and support for traditional administrators who want to learn new approaches. Allow natural evolution rather than forced change. And if traditional worlds choose to maintain current systems, then they maintain current systems, Captain Chun said simply. Supreme Admiral, we're not trying to impose our solutions on anyone. We're trying to make sure that beings who want better options have access to them. And you believe this approach will work? Professor Chong gestured, and the display showed historical analysis that compared forced governmental transitions with voluntary adoption patterns. Supreme Admiral, every sustainable political change in human history happened when people chose transformation rather than had it imposed on them. Force creates resistance. Choice creates investment. Kethvar studied the data flowing across the displays, showing projected outcomes for different implementation approaches. The mathematics were clear. Voluntary adoption created stable transitions, while forced change created cycles of resistance and counter-resistance. Supreme Admiral, he said, the data supports gradual voluntary transition as the optimal approach for long-term stability. Even though it means the hegemony, as we know it, will eventually cease to exist. Kethvar found himself thinking about the station being built outside, where beings from across the galaxy work together on projects that none of them could have achieved alone. About colonial worlds where children from different species learned together and adults collaborated on solutions to problems that had been considered unsolvable. About human fleets that move through space like living organisms, adapting and responding to situations faster than any centralized command could coordinate. Sir, he said slowly, I think the hegemony, as we know, it has already ceased to exist. The question is whether it evolves into something better or fragments into something worse. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen was silent for several minutes, studying displays that showed the scope of changes already underway across dozens of worlds. I will present your proposal to the Council, he said finally. But, Commander, I want your honest assessment. Are the humans trustworthy partners in this transition, or are they simply more sophisticated conquerors? Kethvar looked around the bridge of the determination, where human officers worked alongside beings from 6 different species on projects that range from developing improved food distribution systems to designing educational programs for children whose biology required completely different learning environments. He thought about months of watching humans approach impossible problems with enthusiastic determination and somehow find solutions that made the impossible merely difficult. Sir, I believe the humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy, he said finally. The bridge fell silent, because they make you believe that things you thought were impossible might actually be achievable. And once you start believing that, everything changes. Supreme Admiral Vorthagen's image studied him for a long moment. Commander, in your professional military opinion, what happens if the hegemony rejects this proposal and chooses military suppression instead? Kethvar thought about human fleets that fought like collective intelligences, about worlds that treated war as collaborative problem-solving, about a species that had spent centuries learning to turn desperate situations into impossible victories. Sir, I believe we would find ourselves fighting an opponent that views military suppression as simply another engineering problem to be solved creatively. And you believe they would win? Sir, I believe they would make us wish we had chosen cooperation instead. Captain Chen laughed, and Kethvar realized the sound had become comforting rather than concerning over the months they had worked together. Commander, she said, you're learning to think like a human. Is that good or bad? That, Admiral Rodriguez replied with a grin that meant someone was about to have their worldview expanded again. Depends on whether you think the galaxy could use more impossible solutions to unsolvable problems. Kethvar looked out at the growing station, where beings who had never imagined working together were creating something unprecedented in galactic history, and realized that his mathematical certainty had led him to the most uncertain conclusion possible, that the future was going to be far more interesting than anything the past had prepared them for. And, for the first time in his military career, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat.